Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're looking into the case of 21-year-old Caitlyn Markham, a case that went unsolved for over a decade. And we've got a really great episode of Anatomy of Murder to help us break down all the details.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild case, and I think it really speaks to how tough these cold cases can be, you know, and how important it is to just keep digging even when it feels hopeless.
Absolutely. So the story starts back on August 14th, 2011 in Fairfield, Ohio. That's when Caitlyn's fiancé, John Carter, reported her missing. He calls 911, sounds super frantic, but even in that initial call, some things just feel off.
Yeah, right away investigators started noticing these inconsistencies. You know, her place is in order, no signs of a struggle.
Mm.
Purse, keys, car, all left behind. It's almost like she just disappeared.
Yeah, and then there's the dog. John was adamant that Caitlyn would never leave her dog locked in the bedroom.
That's definitely a weird one. I mean, you don't usually see someone lock their dog up if they're planning on leaving or, if they're being taken against their will. Really makes you wonder what happened in those last moments before she vanished.
It's just another piece of the puzzle, right? So this kicks off a huge search. Tons of people combing through Fairfield, but nothing. And for 2 years, the case just goes cold. Until April 2013, over in Indiana, just across the state border in Cedar Grove. That's when things take a really dark turn.
The couple's out looking for scrap metal when they stumble across some skeletal remains. And tragically, one of the bags they find has a human jawbone in it.
Awful. And those remains are identified as Caitlyn's. Cause of death, homicide. But because of the condition of the remains, they can't figure out exactly how she died.
Yeah, that's where forensic science comes in, but it's a challenge for sure. When you don't have a clear cause of death, you got to lean on other evidence to figure out the story. I mean, they can try to find trauma on the bones, but decomposition makes that really hard.
So it's like working with a puzzle, but you don't have all the pieces.
Exactly. And in this case, those missing pieces could be the key to everything. Now, with all this going on, suspicion naturally falls on John Carter, being the fiancé. It's a pretty typical scenario in these missing person cases, but
Yeah.
You got to remember, innocent until proven guilty.
Right, of course. But there were things about how John acted that raised red flags from day one. Like even the 911 dispatcher picked up on something strange in his voice.
It's interesting how intuition can be such a factor in investigations. Those gut feelings can lead to breakthroughs, but you got to have hard evidence to back them up.
For sure. So investigators looked into John's alibi for the night Caitlyn disappeared. He said he was at a party, and at first his story seemed to check out. Witnesses placed him there, and his computer activity matched up with him going home afterwards.
So it was looking like a dead end. But while they're focusing on John, other leads topped up. There was a guy with a history of sexual offenses who worked near Caitlyn's place. And even Caitlyn's father was looked at for a while.
Sounds like they were leaving no stone unturned, trying to cover all the bases.
Definitely. But each lead kind of fizzled out. Alibis checked out, or there just wasn't enough to connect anyone to Caitlyn's disappearance. And as time went on, things just went cold, and I felt like justice might never come.
But then in 2020, a new investigator enters the scene, Paul Newton. And he gets a tip that seems like it's going to crack the case wide open.
It came from a woman who said her mother and her mother's boyfriend were approached at a bar years earlier by some guy who said he needed a van to get rid of a body. And he specifically said it was Caitlyn Markham's body.
Wow, that's huge. You'd think that would be the missing piece they needed.
At first, it seemed like it. Paul jumped right on it, tracked down the guy who supposedly said all this. But as he dug deeper, he realized the whole thing was just a nasty rumor. It was a dead end, but it ended up having a huge impact on the investigation.
So even though it was a fake lead, it kind of sparked something in Paul's mind.
Exactly. Paul's a super thorough guy. He started going through all the old case files, combing through every little detail, and wouldn't you know it, on the flight back from talking to that tipster, he had a breakthrough. He started seeing connections he'd missed before, and he became convinced that this case could be solved.
That's wild how a false lead can sometimes point you in the right direction. Like it forces you to look at everything from a new angle.
That's exactly what happened here. But Paul knew he couldn't handle this alone. This case file was massive. He needed help sorting through mounds of information. And that's where Ally Weissman comes in.
Ally, the legal assistant with a passion for cold cases. What a great team.
They were perfect together. Ally's super sharp, has an eye for detail, and she was all in on helping Paul crack this case. They started by going back over all the evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and slowly but surely a new picture of John and Caitlyn's relationship started to come into focus.
So it seems like in those first interviews, John was painting this picture of a happy, loving relationship. But now with Paul and Ally digging deeper, cracks are starting to show.
Right? Like friends of Caitlyn's started opening up, saying that she had actually confided in them about being unhappy in the relationship. She felt stuck, worried about John's lack of direction and his financial instability.
Okay, that definitely changes things. And there was that whole thing at the credit union from the Anatomy of Murder episode. Didn't John's mother take Caitlyn to apply for a credit card?
Yeah, and that interaction starts to make a lot more sense with this new information. So John's mother's there, and she kind of jokingly offers to co-sign, but only if Caitlyn promises to take John to Colorado. It was meant to be funny, but Caitlyn's reaction was like the opposite.
She was serious about it.
Yeah.
And clearly not happy. Almost like the thought of being financially tied to John was terrifying.
Exactly. And on top of that, Caitlyn canceled the application just a few days later. It really seems like she's looking for a way out, trying to gain some financial independence from John.
Yeah, it's like all these little details, these glimpses into how she was feeling suddenly become super important. Like they shift the whole narrative from a perfect relationship to one that was maybe falling apart.
So was there also something about two teenage boys who saw a car like John's the night Caitlyn disappeared?
Yeah, that came up in the initial investigation, but it seemed unimportant at the time. So these two kids, they snuck out to meet up with a friend, and they happened to see a red Ford Focus, kind of like John's pull into his driveway around 1:30 in the morning.
Hold on. Just hours after he said he last saw her. And didn't they see the car driving towards Caitlyn's place afterwards?
That's right. It seems like a small detail, but when you think about the timeline and what we're learning about their relationship, it becomes a huge red flag. Why would John be at his house in the middle of the night when he thought Caitlyn was safe at home?
Doesn't really add up.
Yeah.
So now Paul and Ally have all this new information that's making John's story seem less and less believable.
Yeah.
What do they do next? They decided to bring John in for questioning again. This was February 2023, almost 12 years after Caitlyn vanished. They laid it all out for him, the inconsistencies in his story, the new witness statements, and they asked him to take a polygraph.
And what happened?
He failed it, big time. The polygraph showed deception, which while it's not admissible in court, it definitely added to their suspicions. So with all this new evidence, they got a search warrant for John's mother's house. That's where he was living at the time.
Okay, and what did they find?
This is where things get really creepy. Investigators found all these poems and writings by John, and let me tell you, they were disturbing, like hinting at inner turmoil, obsession, and violence. One line that really stands out is, "Deep down, I love her. You want to kill her, but I love her. She must die. I can't kill her. Yes, you can."
Whoa, that is chilling. It's like looking straight into a dark and twisted mind. It's hard to believe someone could write stuff like that and then just go about their life like everything's normal.
It's definitely unsettling. And it's important to remember that these writings alone don't prove he killed Caitlyn, but they do give us a peek into his mental state. And they paint a much darker picture of him than the one he originally presented.
For sure. So were there any other big discoveries during the search?
There was one. On the back of a door in John's room, they found the phrase, "I slit your wrist with the key to your heart."
That's incredibly specific. And didn't the forensic anthropologist who looked at Caitlyn's remains find cut marks on her left wrist?
They did. And while they couldn't say for sure what caused those marks because of the decomposition, finding that phrase written by John adds a whole other layer to it. It makes you wonder if those cuts happened before or after she died, and if they were meant to be symbolic in some way.
So after more than 10 years of searching for answers, it seems like things were finally coming together. The evidence against John was piling up, and he couldn't keep pretending he was innocent anymore.
You got it. In March 2023, 12 years after Caitlyn disappeared, John Carter was indicted on 2 counts of murder. It was a victory for Paul and Ally, for Caitlyn's family, and for everyone who had been fighting for justice in this case. They had a trial date, set mountains of evidence, and tons of witnesses ready to go.
It seemed like Caitlyn would finally get her day in court, but then just 2 weeks before the trial, something totally unexpected happened, right? John took a plea deal.
Yeah, he did just a couple weeks before the trial. John pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter. He claimed that Caitlyn's death was an accident that happened during an assault.
So he basically dodged a murder charge and a possible life sentence. What was the sentence for involuntary manslaughter again?
3 years.
3 years? That must have been hard for Caitlyn's family and friends to swallow.
It was. And it brings up a lot of tough questions about plea deals and how they work in the justice system. Prosecutors have to weigh a lot of things like how strong their case is, the risk of going to trial and maybe not getting a conviction at all, and how a long trial would impact the victim's family.
I can imagine there's also this push to get some closure, especially in a case that's dragged on for so long.
Definitely. I mean, in this case, the whole community had been waiting for answers for over a decade. So the plea deal, while maybe not satisfying in terms of the sentence, at least it gave a clear resolution. John admitted he was guilty and he was held accountable, even if some people felt like the punishment wasn't enough.
It's a tough situation all around, and even though John's behind bars, there are still so many unanswered questions. Like, we might never know exactly what happened that night, the details of the assault, or why he did it.
And that's one of the things that makes this case so haunting. There's this feeling of incompleteness, like the story's only been half told. But even with those lingering questions, the investigation did achieve something important. Justice was served, even if it took a long time. Paul and Ally's dedication to this case, their commitment to looking at old evidence and finding new leads, that's what brought Caitlyn's killer to justice.
It's a powerful reminder that persistence matters, and that even small details can be crucial in a complicated investigation.
And, for anyone listening, I think this deep dive shows how important it is to pay attention to what's happening around you. You never know what small observation could be the key to solving a mystery or giving a grieving family some closure.
It's a reminder to trust your instincts, to be aware, and to never lose hope, even when things seem impossible.
Caitlyn's story, as tragic as it is, reminds us how precious life is and how we should cherish every moment. It also shows us the strength of the human spirit, the relentless pursuit of justice, and the power of hope.
This deep dive has taken us on a real emotional journey. Sadness, anger, frustration, but in the end, a sense of relief that Caitlyn's case was finally closed.
It leaves us with a lot to think about. The complexities of the justice system, the things that drive people to violence, and the importance of supporting victims' families as they try to heal and find peace.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the disappearance and death of Caitlyn Markham. It's a case that will stick with us, and we hope it sparks some important conversations and reflections for you too.